This QuickLearn Bullet summarizes the key features of a credit default swap, or CDS, including the principal parties involved, the definition of a credit event, the calculation of payments before and after a credit event occurs, and a number of other important considerations. We summarize first the principal features of a standard single name CDS contract, i.e. one that relates to a single underlying entity rather than a larger pool. The contract defines the following: who are the two parties to the transaction, typically known as the protection buyer and the protection seller; the entity to which the transaction is tied; the events that trigger the main payout, if any, under the contract; the means and different alternatives for executing this payout; and finally, the other principal items such as tenor, frequency of payments, notional amount, and so on. The diagram appearing in front of you describes the principal mechanics of a fairly standard CDS. A protection buyer and a protection seller enter into a 5-year swap on a $10 million notional amount, under which the buyer will make quarterly payments to the seller equal to 1% of the swap notional annualized, or $250,000 per quarter, assuming a 30-360 convention is adopted. This 1% rate is normally referred to as the CDS spread, a term we will use throughout this discussion. The transaction is specifically tied to a third party, called the reference entity, whose financial condition will be monitored throughout the life of the swap, but which is not a party to the transaction. The contract defines certain events, referred to as credit events, which have important consequences to the two parties. It has been typical in recent years to define credit event to include both a failure by the reference entity to meet any of its payment obligations under its principal debts, or a voluntary or involuntary bankruptcy filing by the reference entity. Such a credit event may or may not occur, of course, during the life of the transaction. The contract then specifies that if no credit event occurs during the entire 5-year life of the contract, then the transaction terminates upon the last quarterly payment. Now suppose a credit event occurs. In most CDS contracts involving a single reference entity, traditionally the contract gave the buyer the right to deliver to the seller a bond or loan issued or guaranteed by the reference entity, which is presumably trading at this point well below par, and to receive from the seller the par value of this instrument. Once a credit event occurs, the CDS contract terminates, and the protection buyer no longer makes any quarterly payments. There are typically a number of restrictions on the type of bond or loan that can be delivered by the buyer, and these regard currency, maturity, governing law, level of seniority, whether it needs to be secured or may be unsecured, and so on. The buyer is typically allowed to deliver any bond or loan that meets these constraints, in order to maximize flexibility for the buyer, and also to minimize the risk of a short squeeze if it is hard to find any one particular bond or loan. To the extent the issuer has a variety of eligible loans or bonds trading at different prices, the buyer has a financial incentive to deliver the one that is trading at the lowest price. This optionality in favor of the buyer is referred to as the cheapest to deliver option, and is reflected in the pricing of the CDS contract to some degree or other, with the CDS spread increasing the greater the delivery alternatives available to the buyer. The delivery of a bond or loan by the buyer and payment of par possibly with accrued interest, by the seller, is usually referred to as physical settlement of the CDS. There exist two other important settlement alternatives. The first alternative involves what is known as cash settlement. Here, no delivery of any bond or loan takes place. Instead, the protection seller delivers to the protection buyer, per $1 of the transaction's notional amount, an amount equal to 1 minus RV, where RV is that obligation's price per dollar of face value determined by the calculation agent from quotes obtained in the marketplace. In summary, this sounds simple enough and offers the convenience of avoiding some of the problems that have arisen when CDS notionals have far exceeded the total stock of eligible deliverables. But it presents other problems, such as the possibility that the parties who are asked to quote have a vested interest in skewing the price away from the market level. Also, what to do in cases in which the prices obtained from different bidders are very far apart, and how to deal with instances of extreme market illiquidity when no prices at all can be obtained in the market. The second alternative that is sometimes used is to provide for so-called digital cash settlement following a credit event. Quite simply, this involves the upfront stipulation in the confirmation of a fixed amount in currency that is paid by the seller to the buyer following a credit event. For example, 45% of the notional amount. Obvious advantages of this alternative include its simplicity and the absence of any concerns regarding the sufficiency of deliverables or the fair determination of market price post-credit event. The principal drawbacks of this alternative are that 1. It does not necessarily provide sufficient protection for a user looking to hedge a specific exposure to the reference entity, since the fall in value of that specific exposure post-credit event may exceed the amount he collects under the digital settlement feature. In turn, this has meant that bank regulators do not grant this alternative the same degree of regulatory capital relief as they do with physical settlement or with settlement on a net cash basis. Returning to the physical settlement mode, you should recognize the economic consequences following a credit event, a gain for the buyer and a loss for the seller. The buyer has been able to deliver an instrument in default, or whose issuer or guarantor is in bankruptcy, to the seller for par. But this instrument presumably is trading at this moment far below par, perhaps at 40 cents on the dollar. So in economic terms, the buyer has achieved a gain of $6 million. The seller, meanwhile, has paid out $10 million in return for taking delivery of an instrument worth $4 million only, so has incurred a loss of $6 million, the flip side of the buyer's gain. We conclude this video by mentioning some important developments that have taken place since the so-called CDS Big Bang, which happened in early 2009. Driven by a need to increase the standardization of CDS contracts as a result of the financial crisis, the CDS Big Bang introduced a number of changes that apply in some cases globally and in others to specified segments only of the CDS market. For our purpose, two are important: the standardization of CDS coupons and the so-called hard wiring of auction mechanisms. Under the first of these changes, CDS on most investment-grade reference entities, initially in North America only, now carry a fixed annualized spread of 100 basis points, while those on high yield or distressed credits now carry a fixed annualized spread of 500 basis points. If, in the investment grade case, the credit of the reference entity improves so that 100 basis points becomes too high relative to this credit risk, then the protection seller pays to the protection buyer an upfront fee at trade inception that represents the fair value of the expected overpayment over the contract's life. Conversely, if the credit deteriorates so that 100 basis points becomes too small relative to this risk, the protection buyer pays the protection seller this upfront fee, this time representing the fair value of the expected underpayment over the contract's life. Market participants have agreed on a single model for deriving from this overpayment or underpayment the required upfront payment. This practice had been common already for CDS on the so-called credit indices and for those on heavily distressed credits. But since Big Bang, it has been applied to a far broader universe of entities. To illustrate, a 5-year CDS on an excellent credit that would be quoted at 50 basis points per annum, absent this convention, would now require a 100 basis point annual spread payment, but also an upfront payment from the seller to the buyer of protection of somewhere around 2% of notional. The second change, the hardwiring of the auction mechanism, involved the replacement of individually negotiated physical settlement language with a pre-agreed mechanism post-credit event for an auction involving leading market makers, the purpose of which is to determine a single recovery value which becomes the basis for net cash settlement for all contracts. This had been implemented for most credit events since 2006, but until Big Bang it required the consent of each CDS counterparty in each instance. Since Big Bang, the standard CDS contract, in applicable cases, now contains binding language that commits both parties to the results of this auction. The specific mechanics of the auctions are very complex and have varied over time, but their objective is to eliminate the need for physical settlement and to standardize the settlement outcome for largely identical contracts. This completes this QuickLearn Bullet on credit default swap basics.